Normite, Haeremite, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. Israel's government is pressing ahead with its military campaign to take total control of Gaza. But with the death toll climbing towards 55,000, will Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heed international opposition, or is Israel headed towards becoming a pariah state? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Some aid has started getting into Gaza again, but the military offensive continues. What's the latest?
We understand that in the last 2 days, something like 90 humanitarian aid trucks have got through. We also understand that yesterday, bakeries restarted, some bakeries in Gaza restarted their operations. Flour was delivered. But there is critical medical assistance that is still not being delivered, or delivered in quantities that are not going to make a huge difference. And the UN estimates that at the moment, Gaza needs at least the 500 trucks it was getting daily before the terrorist attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023.
The Hamas attack of 7th of October 2023, which resulted in 1,200 people being killed and another 251 taken hostage, that was terrible. But what Israel has done since seems a long way away from its traditional value of an eye for an eye that was supposed to limit or prevent retribution from spiralling. What is Netanyahu's goal?
Well, according to Netanyahu, the goal is pretty plain, that Israel wants to take control of Gaza. And also it's his government, his far-right coalition government, have announced plans to annex West Bank in 2025. Both of these moves are illegal. So I think the Israeli government is quite clear that essentially it wants to expand the boundaries of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians where they live. There is another worrying development is that both Israel and the United States plan to establish their own humanitarian aid distribution operation in the near future. That's strongly opposed by the UN. The UN is widely seen as impartial, except by Israel, which doesn't, waste any opportunity to rubbish and condemn the UN. But for many aid organisation, that's a worrying step, because it appears that the distribution of aid, if it's exclusively in the hands of Israel and the US, these are not disinterested observers. Mr. Trump has already said that he has no problems with the displacement of the Palestinians from Gaza. In fact, when he made that proposal to own Gaza, he did say the Palestinians would have to be displaced from that area. So I think that plan is causing a great deal of consternation, because there is a fear that food will only be available in the areas where the US and Israel want to give food, and indeed will only give food to certain people.
Traditional Western values are built on treating others how you want to be treated. What has the Western response been to what's happening in Gaza?
Pretty weak. The most disappointing thing about this situation, well, it's not the most disappointing, it's one of the disappointing features, has been the inability of liberal democracies to live up to the values and ideals that they have about the rule of law internationally. And with the exception of a few countries, Spain, Ireland, and to some degree New Zealand, have been pretty consistent on the need for an immediate ceasefire and a two-state solution. Other countries, like Germany, also the United Kingdom, they are becoming increasingly concerned about the food situation, but for much of the last 18 months have continued to arm Israel's. And so, in short, they have contributed or been complicit. And of course, the United States has provided about 4/5 of the munitions that have killed the near 54,000 people in Gaza. I think the most alarming thing about this has been that liberal democracies have not put enough pressure until recently on Israel to make a distinction between civilian and military targets. And it was quite clear by the end of October 2023 that Israel was not conducting a classic counter-terrorist campaign. If you talk to military specialists, they will tell you that one of the hallmarks of an effective counter-terrorist campaign is to make sure that you only target those responsible for terrorist acts. You simply, as a matter of fact, do not target innocent civilians. Well, 19,000 children have been killed since the 7th of October. And by definition, according to the State Department, they're not members of Hamas. So this is collateral damage on a colossal scale, and it's a terrible failure, I think, of liberal democracies to live up to the ideals that they articulate. And there's another big failure here, because I said the liberal democracies haven't got it on their own. The biggest failure of all has been the failure of the UN Security Council to fulfill its formal responsibility to ensure peace and security in a region like Gaza. And we all know the reason for that, and we've discussed it many times. The reason for that is that 5 countries have the veto, and one of them hasn't hesitated to use it. So we've had a situation where the UN Security Council has been stymied in its efforts to bring a ceasefire and has effectively contributed to the perpetuation of a conflict with savage consequences for people who are not members of Hamas or involved in the attack on Israel. So, you know, I think when there is a ceasefire at some point, there has to be, I'd like to see New Zealand show a bit of leadership on this issue. There has to be a really hard rethink about how long can we have this situation where 5 countries on the planet decide matters of war and peace for everyone. Now, this is completely unacceptable in the 21st century. And I would think that countries like New Zealand and Australia should be leading the charge to get the reform of the UN Security Council so that the veto cannot be exercised in this way, because it's clearly an abuse of power.
In the meantime, what does this mean? Is Netanyahu simply going to be able to continue what he's doing?
Well, the United States is a key player in all this. And the United States, at the moment, Mr. Trump has had strained relations with Netanyahu. He recently, during his visit to the Middle East, didn't visit Israel. He also had direct negotiations with Hamas to get the return of an American-Israeli citizen. And I'm not sure he shares Netanyahu, the messianic vision of the Netanyahu government for the occupation of Palestinian territories. But he's very pragmatic, and he seems completely committed to Israel on his own terms. And the fact that he's organising with Israel to take charge of the humanitarian operation and effectively sidelining the UN, it only confirms what we already thought about Mr. Trump. He does not like international institutions. He doesn't like multilateralism. He likes the use of power. And so in the short term, it's difficult to see how pressure can be mounted against Netanyahu. There have been some signs this week that things might change. The UK and a number of other countries, I think it was Canada as well, indicated that they were completely dissatisfied with the aid efforts, or the lack of them, by Israel. We have a situation here, Bruce, where we have a humanitarian blockade for the last since early March. And everybody just seems to accept that. We didn't accept that situation when the Soviet Union imposed a blockade on Berlin. An airlift was organised. One of the interesting things about this situation is there doesn't seem to be any political will amongst Arab countries to drop food or to take ways of circumventing this blockade. So it's difficult to be optimistic. There are signs that liberal democracies, as I said before, are trying to apply some belated pressure to Netanyahu. The EU has the capacity to apply real pressure because it's one of the biggest trade partners of Israel, and it has real clout economically. But again, the EU's divided on this. Germany's already said any sanctions against Israel's off the table. So it's difficult to see how they can speak with one voice in that. What we are seeing, and our Foreign Minister, Mr. Peters, alluded to this, recently New Zealand was one of 22 countries which said two things must be done immediately. That is, that there must be no restrictions on humanitarian aid, and it must happen quickly. That was a pretty firm statement for 22 countries. But the question is, the critics would say, well, that's all talk. What are you going to do about it? And when it comes to hurting Israel, I'm not suggesting they should be hurt. I'm just saying, what can you do to make a country change its mind when it's applying a humanitarian blockade, which is having disastrous consequences for a population, many of whom have nothing to do with Hamas? You realise the international community is short of options. And again, you have to come back to unfortunately, the failure, the lack of an authoritative international organisation. It's very difficult to be optimistic at the moment, Bruce. It seems like, to come back to your question, that Mr. Netanyahu will probably continue as he has been. And there has been an incident in Washington in the last couple of days where, unfortunately, 2 members of the Israeli embassy in Washington were killed. This is very counterproductive because these are public servants. They may even disagree with the policies of the government they serve. This happens. And unfortunately, they've been targeted by someone chanting Free Palestine. Well, the effects of that, killing is likely to have, unfortunately, adverse effects for the population in Gaza who are Palestinian. So it's difficult to be optimistic at the moment. I would like to see smaller countries and middle powers speaking up more to try to get this situation resolved. Look, Mr. Netanyahu, there's an old saying in politics and sport: you're only as good as your opponents allow you to be. And in short, those who actually disagree with Mr. Netanyahu's approach to this problem are still not doing much to back up their talk. So, and it's difficult to see where that action is going to come from. So at the moment, it looks like the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.